Hello there. Tonight we journey once again back to medieval times, where we will debunk one of the most misunderstood parts of this time in history. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the clang of steel, the glint of sun off polished helmets, knights charging across rolling green fields with banners flying high and glory in their hearts. That's the version you've been fed through movies, through video games, through romanticized tales that turned 1,000 years of violence into a fairy tale. But here's the truth. Medieval warfare was not chivalry. It was not noble. It was not clean, heroic, or even remotely orderly. It was chaos. It was mud-slicked fields soaked in blood, the screams of the dying echoing off cold stone walls, and the ever-present stench of unwashed bodies, burned wood, and rotting flesh. Forget what Hollywood taught you. This is not a story of valiant knights on pristine battlefields. This is a journey into the darker, grittier, and far more human world of warfare as it was truly waged in the Middle Ages. A world where power was everything and mercy was rare, where peasants with pitchforks faced off against elite warriors clad in steel, where deception, starvation, disease, and terror were as much weapons as sword or spear. This is the history you were never told, the one scrubbed clean from textbooks and legend, the one where battles weren't decided by strength alone, but by terrain, by cunning, by sheer ruthlessness, and by a bunch of rather strange-looking weapons. What follows may challenge everything you think you know about the medieval world. This is the untold story of medieval warfare, not the one sung by bards, but the one whispered through cracked teeth on blood-soaked ground. If you enjoy tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like, subscribe, or maybe comment on where you are listening from. So whether you are getting ready to settle down for the night, looking for a distraction from work or study, or maybe just looking to relax for a while, you've found the right place. Quiet the noise of the modern world. Sit back, relax, and we will begin our journey. Long before the codes of chivalry and polished helms of mounted knights came to define the battlefield, medieval Europe was a patchwork of war bands, blood feuds, and tribal vengeance. It was not yet the age of banners and heraldry. It was the age of axes and fighting in the dark. There were no professional armies in these early centuries. Only men bound by kin, coin, or terror. Groups like the Saxons, Franks, and Visigoths didn't march under royal decree. They followed war chiefs with battle-scarred faces and hands made rough by slaughter. Loyalty was measured not by allegiance to a crown, but by shared blood, family bloodlines, and enemies killed. To use the word warfare for what they did is almost an insult to the word warfare. It was more like slightly organized chaos. A raid could happen without warning. A rival clan might descend on your village before the sun had barely started to rise. One moment, a child fed chickens in the yard. The next, he was running, barefoot and screaming, as his father's head rolled across the floor and fire swallowed the roof. These were not neat lines of battle. There was no trumpet to signal the start. Only sudden and barbaric violence. And worse, it was expected. These weren't armies looking for glory. They were war bands looking for food, slaves, land, or revenge. The reasons didn't matter. What mattered was that no one was ever safe. Ambush was the preferred tactic, fast, dirty, effective. Guerrilla-style fighting was the norm. A group of 30 warriors might lie hidden for hours in a forest clearing, their blades coated in fat to dull the gleam of the metal. When a rival hunting party passed, they didn't charge, they pounced. Screams echoed through the trees like the cries of animals caught in traps, because that's what it was, a trap. In these battles, there were no rules. Spears were thrust not into chests but bellies, the soft part, the part that spilled. Men had no shame in carving open their enemies as they begged for life. Fingers were bitten off when swords were dropped, teeth used as weapons. Even the dead were robbed while still warm. Weapons, boots, food, nothing was sacred. And the brutality didn't end with the fighters. Villages were soft targets. Thatched roofs went up in flames with a single torch. Livestock was slaughtered not just for meat, but out of spite. Women were taken, not just for labor, not just for marriage, but as prizes, to break the enemy's spirit, to poison his bloodline. Children were enslaved or left to starve in the ashes. War, in these early medieval days, wasn't fought on a battlefield. It was brought right to your door. And yet, this wasn't chaos for chaos' sake. There was strategy, terrifying, cruel, but effective strategy. The Franks, before becoming the kingdom we associate with Charlemagne and holy emperors, were known for their cunning. They'd lure enemies out with bait, a lone boy in a clearing, a stranded cart with broken wheels. Then they would descend like wolves from the woods. The Saxons had no cavalry to speak of, but they understood terrain. Their fighters moved like ghosts through the bogs, their bodies painted in mud, waiting for soldiers of more civilized nations to get bogged down, literally. These were warriors who learned to fight from the age of 7, who trained not with tutors, but through blood. Their armor, if they had any, was scavenged or handmade. Boiled leather, iron scraps sewn onto old tunics. Their shields were round and simple. Their weapons, axes that doubled as tools, spears that doubled as walking sticks. And then there were the traditions, dark, chilling, nearly forgotten. Some tribes believed that taking the head of your enemy gave you his strength. After battle, corpses would be dragged back to camps, not for burial, but for desecration. Severed heads were mounted on spears and placed outside sleeping huts, a grotesque kind of trophy. Others believed that if your enemy's body was burned before he was properly mourned, his spirit would never reach the afterlife. So they burned them, always, alive, if they had time. Early medieval war wasn't about conquest. It was about survival, about vengeance, about making sure that your people lived, even if it meant butchering someone else's. We call it warfare, but to those who lived it, it was just life, a cycle. Raid and retaliate, kill or be killed. Every son expected to fight, every daughter expected to flee or be taken. Peace was a rare luxury. Paranoia was the currency of safety. And yet, from this carnage, something new began to form. As these early war bands evolved and tribes unified under powerful chieftains and proto-kings, warfare began to take a different shape. Fortified settlements, standing militias, hierarchies of command. From the savagery of tribal raids, a new class of warrior would emerge, the knight. But before we put on the armor and raise the banners, remember this: the roots of medieval warfare were not forged in castles or tournaments. Sometimes the most terrifying weapon wasn't a sword or a siege tower. It was fear itself. Before the first arrow flew, before the first sword struck, the battle had already begun, inside the mind. The medieval battlefield was a place of brutality, but also of calculation. And nothing was calculated more carefully than terror. If your enemy feared you before the fight even began, half the war was already won. Fear was a weapon, one that didn't require sharpening, only spectacle. Imagine this: you're a farmer, barely more than a boy, handed a blunt spear and push toward a makeshift wooden wall. You've never held a weapon before. You've never killed anything larger than a chicken. Then, over the horizon, you hear it. Not drums, not horses. Screams. High-pitched, inhuman. War cries so loud they seem to shake the earth itself. That sound isn't coming from warriors in neat rows. It's coming from wild-eyed men dressed in black, howling like beasts, pounding on their shields with skulls strapped to their belts. Would you fight, or would you run? That was the point. Medieval commanders understood that terror spread faster than fire. It didn't just weaken enemy morale, it infected it. And once fear took root, it rotted courage from the inside out. Some armies turned fear into art. The Normans, for example, were masters of calculated brutality. When they moved through rebellious territories, they didn't just kill, they displayed. Severed heads were mounted on pikes outside villages. Entrails were nailed to doors. In one infamous instance during the harrying of the North, William the Conqueror's forces salted the fields of entire regions and left the bodies unburied, so wolves and crows could do the rest. He wasn't just punishing rebels, he was making an example of them. Starvation wasn't just a side effect, it was the message. And then there were the fires. Entire villages were burned, not because they held strategic value, but because fire sent a clear signal. We were here. We can come again. Smoke could be seen for miles, rising like black fingers clawing at the sky. For survivors, it wasn't just a smell of destruction. It was a warning. The Mongols, although not European, deserve mention here too. Not because they invaded the continent, but because their tactics left deep psychological scars across Eurasia that echoed into Europe's own military thinking. The Mongols would spare cities that surrendered and utterly annihilate those that resisted. They released survivors, always a few, deliberately, so they would flee to the next city and tell tales of what they'd seen. Bodies stacked like wood, rivers running red, children nailed to walls. The effect was devastating. Cities surrendered without a fight, terrified of suffering the same fate. European commanders took note. Soon, psychological warfare wasn't just a bonus, it was part of the plan. There are reports of armies catapulting severed heads, not at soldiers, but over city walls, into the homes of civilians. The message was simple. Give up, or you're next. Others sent plague corpses into besieged cities, not just to spread disease, but to spread despair. There's a story of an attacking army throwing the dismembered limbs of the city's own messengers back over the walls. They had dared to try to negotiate. This was the answer. And when psychological warfare wasn't brutal, it was theatrical. Trumpets would blare not to rally troops, but to create the illusion of a much larger army. Fires lit at night in great number, enough to make a warband look like a legion. Cloaks dyed in enemy colors to sow confusion, or fake retreats, drawing enemies into carefully laid traps, only to slaughter them when their formation broke. But the most insidious weapon of all wasn't sound or spectacle. It was betrayal. Traitors were gold. A single bribed gatekeeper could do more damage than 1,000 archers. And when that tactic succeeded, when a castle fell without a single stone being thrown, the enemy would make sure the betrayal was well known. Not hidden, not secret, broadcasted, because nothing sows fear faster than the idea that your own might be next. Who can we trust becomes the question whispered in the ranks. And trust, once broken, is harder to repair than any siege wall. The medieval world understood the mind better than we think. They didn't have Freud. They didn't need him. They had war, and fear, raw, primitive animal fear, was the currency of conquest. You could break bones with swords, but you could break entire kingdoms with fear. So the next time you see an old battlefield marked by moss and silence, remember this. The war wasn't just fought with blades. It was fought with symbols, screams and shadows. A child seeing his village burn, a soldier watching heads roll across the mud, a town surrendering before the enemy even arrives. That, too, was war. And yet, medieval warfare wasn't just about killing. It was about making people wish they were dead. When we think of medieval war, we imagine ironclad titans thundering into battle atop armored horses, lances poised, banners streaming. But the truth, that shining image was the minority. For every knight in polished plate, there were 100 peasants, ragged, terrified, and utterly unprepared. They had no choice. When a king declared war or a noble levied troops, he didn't draw from standing armies. He summoned the peasantry. By law or threat of punishment, farmers were ripped from their fields, millers from their stones, shepherds from their flocks, handed spears they'd never used, and marched off to die in battles they barely understood. They weren't soldiers. They fought because they owed service. Not honor, not glory, obligation. And what they were given, if anything, was pathetic. Some received rusted spears, others a crude wooden pike, or if they were lucky, a padded jacket called a gambeson, stiff with sweat from the last man who wore it. Helmets were rare. Metal armor? Unthinkable. Most wore the same threadbare tunic they farmed in, maybe stuffed with straw for protection. Their boots, if they had them, leaked. Their hands were blistered before the fight even began. Training, that was a luxury. A peasant's education in war came in the form of his friend's blood spattering across his face when the first arrow struck. These men, these half-starved, overworked farmers, were shoved into formation, given vague instructions, and told to stand their ground against charging cavalry. When the horses came, when the ground began to quake beneath iron hooves, some held their spears steady. Most ran. Who wouldn't? Imagine it. No shield, no armor, just a wooden staff and the smell of your own fear. You watch knights, monsters in steel, bearing down on you with lances lowered. And beside you, a boy of 15 and a man old enough to be his grandfather, both gripping their weapons like firewood. That wasn't battle. That was slaughter. And the commanders knew it. They didn't expect peasants to win. They expected them to die slowly enough to tire the enemy, to clog the field with bodies, to be bait. Sometimes they were pushed forward just to absorb arrows, human sponges for the storm that came next. And if they fled, they were cut down by their own side for cowardice. But their suffering didn't end when the battle did. Wounded peasants were not taken to surgeons. They were abandoned. Crushed legs, shattered arms, punctured guts. No priest, no healer. Nothing. Just the dirt and the flies and the slow, lonely agony of death. Their bodies weren't buried. They were stripped for anything useful. Boots, belts, maybe a crust of bread in a pocket, and left to rot in the mud. Days later, only the crows remembered their names. If they survived, they went home, if home was still standing, limping back to fields they no longer had the strength to till, with no compensation, no reward. Maybe a scar, maybe a missing eye, and no one to thank them. No songs, no monuments, just more hunger, more cold. They were never meant to be remembered. They were filler, statistics, the grey mass that every noble army relied on but never respected. And what of their families? Wives were left behind to fend for themselves, often widowed without a word. Children learned to beg before they could walk. In lean seasons, the absence of a father, or brother, or son meant starvation. Entire villages were hollowed out by war, not because they were conquered, but because they were used. And when those peasant soldiers did fight back, when they tried to stand against injustice, the results were catastrophic. Take the English peasants' revolt of 1381. Thousands of angry, armed men rose up against crippling taxes and endless conscription. They stormed castles, burned records, demanded rights, and for a moment, just a moment, they tasted power. Then the nobles struck back. Hundreds were hanged, others drawn and quartered, heads displayed on London Bridge, not as justice, but as a message. Know your place. Know what happens when you dare to believe you matter. Because in the eyes of the ruling class, peasant soldiers were not men. They were tools, dispensable, forgettable, necessary. You didn't need to teach them to fight. You just needed to point them in the right direction and let them die. No names, no faces, just blood in the mud. That was the reality of medieval war for most who fought it. And it was never glorious. The medieval world loved its rules. Men fought, women prayed, bled, birthed, and obeyed. That was the order, that was the law. And yet, scattered through the blood-soaked pages of history, there are names that defied it. Women who took up arms not because they were allowed to, but because they had no other choice. And when they fought like fire. Take Jeanne de Clisson. Once a noblewoman of wealth and privilege, she became death itself in black sails. When her husband was executed by the French crown, falsely, unjustly, she sold everything, bought a warship, and painted it black. The sails, the hull, even the crew's armor, black. Then she hunted French ships like a predator. She gave no quarter. Survivors were executed on deck. She was a noblewoman turned pirate turned avenger. Her name spread like wildfire through the French Navy. Mothers whispered it to frighten their children. The Lioness of Brittany, they called her. She didn't command from a distance. She led charges, drew blades, killed. Or consider Matilda of Tuscany, a warrior countess who commanded armies at a time when women weren't even allowed near war councils. She wasn't symbolic, she was strategic. In a world where loyalty shifted like smoke, she held firm. When the Pope needed protection, Matilda raised troops and fortified cities. She wasn't the mascot, she was a general. And the men who underestimated her learned quickly that she was far more dangerous than the gold-embroidered robe she sometimes wore. And yet, these were the elite, the visible few. There were many more, nameless, faceless, undocumented, who picked up swords when the walls fell and their husbands died screaming in the courtyard. Women who didn't wear armor, but still stood in blood-soaked doorways with boiling water and butcher's knives when raiders came. They weren't trained, they weren't strong, but they were there. Siege warfare made warriors of many. During attacks on castles and towns, women were not sheltered. They were pressed into action. They hauled stones for the walls, put out fires, loaded arrows into quivers, dragged wounded men from the gates, and if it came to it, they fought. Not in open combat, not in duels, but in desperation, with scalding oil, with farming tools, with broken glass, with anything they could get their hands on. In the siege of Tortosa in 1148, Catalan chronicles specifically mention women on the front lines, not behind men, but next to them, defending the walls. In other records, we find mention of women disguised as men, taking the places of brothers or lovers in war bands, and sometimes never revealing the truth even after the war was over. One chronicler, describing a garrison's last stand, writes of a boy who fought with the fury of 10 men and died with lips still cursing the enemy. Months later, they learned the truth. The boy had been a woman. No name was recorded. Even in death, she remained anonymous. But not all women had to dress like men to fight. Joan of Arc shattered every rule and did it publicly. A peasant girl who claimed to hear voices from saints, she stepped onto a battlefield in full armor, took command of troops, and turned the tide of the 100 Years' War. Men followed her, feared her, not just because she was righteous, but because she won. She broke siege lines, rallied broken armies, and led from the front, not by permission, but by sheer force of will. And for that, she was burned alive, not for heresy, not for treason, but because a woman in armor issuing orders to noble-born men was too dangerous to let live. Even that wasn't enough to erase her memory. She became a martyr, a myth, a saint, and her legacy cracked the foundations of how medieval Europe saw power, gender, and warfare. But Joan was not the only one who died for daring to command. Throughout the medieval world, women who stepped outside the expected roles were punished, not for failure, but for daring, for winning, for making men feel less invincible. Their stories were scrubbed, silenced, reduced to rumor. But their presence remains in the gaps between official records, in the whispers of local legends, in the bone-deep fear commanders felt when they realized that the enemy they were fighting was not who they thought. Because war does not care what you are, only what you do. And in the fires of medieval warfare, many women proved themselves just as ruthless, just as brilliant, and just as deadly as any man who ever rode into battle. Honor died quickly in the medieval world, often with a knife in the back. The idea that medieval war was governed by codes of chivalry is a lie. A bedtime story whispered by those who never set foot on a battlefield. For all the talk of valor and gallantry, most wars weren't won with swords clashing in open combat. They were won in the dark, with poison, betrayal, and lies. Because when survival was on the line, rules became suggestions, and the most cunning generals were not the ones who stood bravest under fire. They were the ones who struck before the fire even began. Take false surrenders, one of the oldest and most despicable tactics in medieval warfare. A castle, under siege, would raise the white flag. The defenders would open the gates. The attacking army would enter, unguarded, relaxed, only to be ambushed the moment they stepped inside. Gates slammed shut behind them. Hidden archers emerged from secret alcoves. Boiling pitch poured from murder holes. What was promised as mercy became massacre. Afterward, the defenders might be slaughtered anyway, because the attackers would never trust them again. Trust was currency in the medieval world, and like all currency, it could be forged. Monks, yes, the very image of piety, were often used as spies. Who would suspect a barefoot man in robes, offering blessings and asking questions? They passed freely through towns, castles, even enemy lines, gathering information for the armies that fed them. Sometimes they carried hidden messages. Sometimes they carried poison. And sometimes they carried blades. There are stories of holy men preaching to one Lord in the morning and leading his enemies through the back gate that night. But perhaps the most devastating deception came not from outside, but from within. Bribery was a silent siege weapon. More than one fortified city fell not by force, but by coin. A handful of gold in the right hand, a captain guarding the gates, a cook in the enemy's kitchen, and an impregnable fortress could become a tomb. Walls that had held firm against catapults and famine crumbled the moment someone on the inside opened the door. Once, a castle in northern France resisted 3 months of siege. Supplies were low, spirits were lower. Then one morning, the gate stood wide open. No attack, no surrender, just silence. When the army entered, they found every man, woman, and child inside already dead, poisoned. The steward had slipped something into the grain stores. No one knew who had paid him, or why. But the lesson stuck. Not all victories required battle. Night raids were another favorite trick. There was no honor in them, just fire and panic. An enemy camp, exhausted from marching, would settle in for the night. Tents pitched, weapons stacked, fires lit. Then, just before dawn, when sleep was deepest, attack, screams, fire arrows, knives in throats, horses set loose. In moments, confusion replaced strategy. Half-naked men stumbled into the dark, slaughtered before they could find their boots. Entire armies were broken without ever forming a line. And worse, these tactics worked. So well, in fact, that they became standard. By the late Middle Ages, feigned retreats, pretending to flee, only to ambush the pursuing enemy, had become common. The Mongols perfected this art, and their European counterparts learned quickly. Whole companies would run in terror, and then, once the enemy broke formation to chase them, wheel around with hidden cavalry waiting in the woods. You thought they were cowards. They were hunters. Deception was also architectural. Secret tunnels beneath castles allowed for sudden escapes or ambushes. Some fortresses were designed with trap chambers, small entry rooms where attackers, thinking they'd broken through, would find themselves surrounded by stone walls, unable to retreat as archers fired from hidden slits above. Death boxes, designed not just to kill, but to humiliate. Even heraldry could lie. Units would fly enemy banners to infiltrate their ranks. One army once disguised itself as a wedding procession, complete with musicians and flower girls, only to burst into bloodshed the moment they crossed the town gate, because nothing disarms like joy, and nothing kills faster than surprise. But deception wasn't only used to defeat enemies. Sometimes it was used to control allies. A noble might tell his men that reinforcements were just a day away. They weren't. Or that peace talks had failed. They hadn't. Or that God himself had blessed their cause. He hadn't. Truth was a tool, sharpened or dulled depending on what the commander needed his men to believe. Because in the medieval world, morale was everything. And lies were often more useful than food. And yet, for all these dirty tricks, for all the betrayal and deceit, the chroniclers, the poets, the bards still sang of honor, still painted war as noble, still fed the illusion that medieval warfare was about courage and steel. But the soldiers knew better. The dying knew better. They knew that battles weren't won by the brave. They were won by the ones who lied best and struck first. When the walls went up and the gates closed, the real horror began. Not outside the city, but within. We imagine sieges as catapults and trebuchets, great stones flying through the air, archers on battlements, and knights storming the walls. But the true story of medieval siege warfare is far darker and far more intimate, because a siege wasn't just a military tactic. It was a slow death sentence imposed on an entire population. And it didn't just target soldiers. It starved children. It drove mothers to madness. It turned cities into mass graves. When an army surrounded a fortified town or castle, they weren't always looking for a quick victory. Quite the opposite. They wanted time to do the work, to let panic, hunger, and despair rot the defenders from the inside. And so they waited. Supplies dwindled. Rats vanished. Bark was boiled for soup. In one infamous siege, starving townsfolk began digging up the recently buried, stripping the flesh from the dead to feed the still living. And when the corpses ran out, they turned on each other. Mothers, delirious, smothered their infants, not out of hatred, but mercy. It's recorded that during the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, one woman roasted her own child and offered it to neighbors. The story is so grotesque that it feels impossible, and maybe it is, but the fact that it was believed, that it was written down, passed on, tells us what people expected sieges to do to the human soul. Disease was constant. The trapped cities turned into festering pits. With sewage overflowing and bodies piling up, plague didn't need long to arrive. Dysentery swept through cramped homes. Children cried themselves hoarse before falling silent forever. And the attackers, they weren't idle. They catapulted corpses over the walls, not just for horror, but infection. Dead horses, diseased beggars, decaying limbs, anything that would rot in the sun and poison the air. Psychological warfare met biological warfare centuries before the term even existed. The besieged tried to keep morale high, but there's only so long you can keep singing when your neighbors are chewing leather and licking the walls for moisture. And then came the breach. When the walls finally fell, when the gates broke open or the enemy tunneled through, what came next wasn't victory. It was vengeance. Total, unapologetic slaughter. For the attacking army, the siege was agony. Disease, exposure, hunger, boredom. When they finally broke in, they were often given free rein, not just as a reward, but as a form of release. No one was spared. Not the old, not the wounded, not the babies. At the siege of Béziers in 1209, a crusader commander famously said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." They did. Women were raped in the shadow of burned churches. Clergy were cut down at their altars. And the blood, according to chroniclers, rose to the knees. That may be poetic exaggeration, but the message is clear. Mercy had no place behind breached walls, and the survivors, if any, they were sold, shackled, made to watch their city burn, their homes, their families, their world, all ash. And sometimes they were forced to help, under guard, as the attackers dismantled the very defenses that once protected them. But what about those who surrendered? Sometimes they were spared. More often, they were lied to. A city would open its gates under promise of clemency, a parchment signed, a handshake exchanged, and still the killing began. Maybe the leaders were executed first. Maybe the common folk were marched outside and processed. Maybe the nobility were kept alive only to be ransomed later. But always the fear lingered. Had they really been spared, or just delayed? Siege warfare wasn't just about taking a place. It was about breaking it, breaking its people, its spirit, its memory. Castles taken by siege were often razed, towns burned, churches looted. Sometimes even the name of the place was struck from maps. It wasn't enough to defeat a city. It had to disappear, because siege wasn't just a military operation. It was psychological devastation, and it didn't end when the fighting stopped. It ended when there was no one left to remember. Some weapons weren't just made to kill, they were made to haunt. We remember the swords, the broad-shouldered knights with gleaming steel at their sides. We remember the longbows at Agincourt and the catapults that smashed stone walls. Those are the stars of medieval warfare, honored, romanticized, lionized in legend. But history has a shadow side, and lurking there, in that cold place between necessity and invention, are the other weapons, the forgotten tools of cruelty, ingenuity, and sheer desperation. They didn't earn songs, but they earned screams. The man-catcher. It looked like something out of a nightmare. A long pole, ending not in a blade but in a vicious iron collar, often lined with spikes. This was the man-catcher, a tool used to unhorse riders or drag nobles from the chaos of a melee without killing them. Because dead men can't be ransomed. Imagine it. You're a knight, your armor dented, your horse stumbling beneath you. You're trying to retreat, bleeding and dazed. And then, out of the crowd, it clamps around your neck. Spikes dig into your flesh. You're yanked backward, choking, flailing, armor clattering against the mud. Not dead, but not free. Held like an animal. The man-catcher didn't kill, it humiliated. War scythes and farmer blades. When peasants were levied to fight, they didn't bring swords, they brought tools. And in their hands, those tools became weapons born of necessity and rage. Scythes, used to harvest wheat, were reforged into sweeping, curved blades. Hammers meant for driving fence posts were repurposed to crush skulls. These weren't elegant weapons. There was no finesse. A war scythe wasn't balanced or light. It was awkward, brutal, and devastating. Peasants fought like reapers. One stroke, one cleave, one desperate blow. They didn't care about honor. They cared about surviving. Sometimes that's deadlier. The Morning Star. The Morning Star was not a poetic name. It was a lie dressed in metaphor. A spiked ball attached to a shaft or chain, designed to cave in helmets and pulp flesh. It combined the weight of a club with the puncturing brutality of nails. Some were mounted on short handles. Others were attached to long chains, swung around with both hands, gaining speed until they smashed into the enemy like a meteor. The real terror of the Morning Star wasn't the pain. It was the unpredictability. The chain made it whip in erratic arcs, slipping past shields, hooking behind armor, sometimes even backfiring and injuring the user. But in the hands of someone who didn't care, or who had nothing left to lose, it was perfect. Boiling oil and quicklime. When sieges dragged on and attackers reached the walls, defenders turned to chemistry. You've heard of boiling oil. Poured from above, it seared flesh, slipped through armor joints, blinded and disfigured. But oil was expensive, so defenders often used boiling water, heated sand, or even molten pitch, anything that would cling to skin and cook it alive. And then there was quicklime. Crushed and powdered, it was dumped onto enemies like flour from murder holes. But when quicklime mixed with moisture, say sweat, or the fluids in your eyes, it reacted violently. It burned, not like fire, like acid. Your helmet became a trap. Your own armor turned into an oven. The men who survived these attacks were often left blind, shrieking, clawing at their faces. That was chemical warfare, centuries before the term existed. Flaming arrows and fire pots. Fire was a constant companion in medieval war, but it wasn't just for burning villages, it was weaponized. Flaming arrows were real, but not in the way Hollywood suggests. You didn't just dip an arrow in fire and shoot it. You wrapped it in oil-soaked cloth, ignited it at the last second, and loosed it high, arcing down onto thatched roofs and wooden siege towers. Their aim wasn't always precision. It was panic. One flaming arrow could ignite a barn. 10 could scatter an entire war camp. But even more fearsome were fire pots, clay or glass containers filled with tar, oil, and pitch, sometimes even laced with sulfur or naphtha. These were thrown like grenades, shattering on impact and spraying burning liquid in every direction. There are records of defenders on castle walls lighting entire bundles of these, tying them to ropes, and swinging them down like flaming wrecking balls into climbing soldiers. Greek fire. No medieval weapon inspired more fear or mystery than Greek fire. Created in the Byzantine Empire, it was a flammable liquid that ignited on contact and could burn on water. Its formula was so secret, it died with the empire. But those who saw it never forgot. Greek fire was sprayed through tubes or hurled in ceramic bombs. It clung to ships, men, even the sea itself. And once it caught, nothing put it out. Not sand, not water. Even in Western Europe, where Greek fire was rare, its legend loomed like a curse. Commanders whispered about it like a supernatural force. Some even tried to replicate it, mixing turpentine, oil, and sulfur into crude imitations that worked just well enough to kill horribly. It wasn't just a weapon, it was alchemy turned to horror. Early hand cannons. Before muskets, before rifles, there were the hand cannons, crude tubular devices forged from iron or bronze, mounted on sticks, and ignited with open flame. They were heavy, slow, and wildly inaccurate, but they were loud, and that was the point. The first time a hand cannon was fired in battle, men thought the heavens were cracking open. Horses reared, soldiers panicked. It was noise warfare, a thunderclap in a world unprepared for it. The balls they fired often missed, but when they hit, they shattered bone, tore through flesh, and blew open shields. It was chaos in your hands, and men used it anyway, because fear was its own kind of bullet. The Bektekorben and poleaxe. As armor improved, blades became less useful, so new weapons emerged, designed not to slice, but to smash. The Bektekorben, Raven's Beak, was a polearm ending in a vicious hook designed to puncture helmets, yank riders from horseback, and rip through plate like tin. The poleaxe, meanwhile, was the Swiss army knife of murder. An axe on one side, a hammer on the other, a spike on top. It wasn't just for killing, it was for dismantling. A single blow could crumple a breastplate, knock you unconscious, then pierce your throat as you lay stunned. These weapons were not ornamental. They were answers to a single question. How do you kill someone wearing full armor? And the answers were brutal. The Godentag and the Dusak. The Godentag, German for good day, was a club covered in iron studs, swung like a greeting with a permanent goodbye. It was a weapon of the common people, meant to crush bones with a cheerful name. The Dusak, meanwhile, was a curved, single-edged blade, often used for training. But in war, it found use as a slashing tool in close quarters. Fast, light, and cheap, it became the favorite of mercenaries who needed a weapon they could draw quickly and discard if needed. Neither were pretty. Both were effective. These weapons are rarely discussed. They don't appear in heroic paintings. Museums don't proudly display them next to suits of armor. They were too crude, too cruel, too real. But they existed, and they mattered, because medieval war wasn't just a contest of swords and shields. It was an arms race of nightmares, one where every new weapon asked the same question. What else can a human body endure? And every answer left someone screaming. If the sword didn't kill you, the cure might. In modern war, the wounded are rushed to hospitals, stabilized by medics, operated on in sterile rooms filled with trained professionals. There's a system, a protocol, a chance. In medieval war, there was none of that. There was only blood, pain, and hope, usually in that order, and almost never in that direction. The battlefield wasn't just a place of death. It was a factory for broken bodies, limbs split by axes, bellies ripped by pikes, faces caved in by maces. But the real horror began after the fighting stopped, because if you survived the battle, you faced something even more brutal. The medicine. Let's be clear, medieval medicine wasn't medicine as we know it. It was guesswork, a blend of superstition, limited anatomy, and religious dogma. And the battlefield? It was a butcher's stall. Bleeding, crushing, infection. These were not complications. They were expected. And treatment was medieval in every sense of the word. Amputations. If a limb was badly wounded, a mangled arm, a crushed leg, there were only two options: cut it off, or let the rot spread and kill you. There were no anesthetics, no numbing agents. If you were lucky, you got a wooden stick to bite down on. If you were really lucky, you passed out before the pain broke you. The surgeon would heat a blade in a fire or grab a bone saw, crude, serrated, unclean, and begin cutting. Screams tore across the field. Men were held down by other soldiers. Blood fountained, flesh peeled, tendons snapped, bone was hacked through, and once it was done, the stump was cauterized with a red-hot iron, not to help you, but to keep you from bleeding to death. The smell of burning meat wasn't from the campfires. It was from your comrades. Most who underwent this procedure died anyway, from shock, from fever, from infection. But for some, it was their only hope. Cauterization and bloodletting. Cauterization wasn't reserved for amputations. It was a catch-all solution for wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. Stab wounds, arrow piercings, crushed fingers. The idea was simple. Burn it shut. Seal the flesh. Stop the bleeding. Hope it heals. Hope. Because often the tissue died. The wound festered. Maggots moved in. But the alternative, uncontrolled bleeding, was a death sentence in its own right. And then there was bloodletting, a practice so widespread it was used for everything. Fever? Let blood. Swollen limb? Let blood. Headache? Blood. Wound? More blood. Barber surgeons carried knives and leeches. They believed illness came from imbalances in the humors, and that draining your life force was the cure. Imagine a soldier already pale from trauma, his arm wrapped in filthy linen, barely breathing, and someone leans over him and says, "We just need to let a little blood to balance your energies." And then he dies, not from the wound, but from the treatment. Arrow extraction. Arrows were among the most common battlefield injuries, and one of the most horrifying to treat. If the arrow passed clean through, the ends might be snapped off and the shaft pulled out. But most didn't. They lodged inside. Arrowheads were barbed, designed to rip on the way out. Removal often did more damage than entry. Surgeons, if you could call them that, would cut around the wound with a dagger or dig into the flesh with iron pincers. No gloves, no disinfectant, just dirty tools and prayer. If the arrow had pierced the gut, the victim was often left to die. There was no way to save them. Their screams would last for hours, sometimes days. Then silence. The healers. The doctors on medieval battlefields were rarely trained. Most were barber surgeons, traveling tradesmen who pulled teeth, set bones, and bled customers in villages for a few coins. Some had genuine skill. Most had only experience. They worked in tents soaked with gore. Tools were reused between patients. Bandages were torn from tunics. Wounds were cleaned with water, sometimes wine if available, and wrapped in cloth that had already touched a dozen other infected bodies. There were no sterilization techniques, no antibiotics, no understanding of germs. Pain was inevitable. Infection was almost guaranteed. Death was more common than survival. And still, they tried. They stitched torn flesh with bone needles and coarse thread. They set broken limbs with wood splints. They applied poultices made from honey, vinegar, herbs, sometimes even manure, believed to draw out evil spirits. And sometimes it worked, but more often the wound turned black. The skin around it swelled, the fever came, and the rot set in. Religion was also deeply tied to medicine. Many believed that illness and injury were divine punishments, signs of sin or tests of faith. That meant battlefield healing often came with sermons, relics, and rituals. Monks offered prayers instead of salves. Some rubbed saintly bones over wounds. Others prescribed pilgrimages for healing, even to men who couldn't stand, let alone walk. Holy water was poured into open wounds. Crosses were branded onto foreheads. One common belief held that wearing an amulet containing a saint's hair would stop bleeding. Another claimed that wounds made by iron could only be healed with silver. Meanwhile, infection spread, and soldiers died in filth, clutching icons instead of aid. Some did survive, against the odds. And what was left of them? Missing limbs, crushed jaws, hollow sockets where eyes once were, burned flesh, twisted backs. There was no rehabilitation, no prosthetics, no pensions. You were a reminder of war's cruelty, and society didn't want to see that. Many were left to beg. Some returned to farms, broken and limping. Others turned to crime, their rage too deep, their options too few. Some were worshipped as martyrs. Others were shunned. But all of them carried the battlefield home in their bodies and in their minds. Because even when the wounds healed, the pain didn't leave. Every step a reminder, every cough, every night spent trying not to scream. But in some cases, soldiers begged not to be treated. They asked their friends to kill them. And their friends did, quietly, quickly, out of mercy. One recorded account from a 14th century battle in the Low Countries describes a soldier pinned under his horse, his legs crushed, one eye hanging from the socket. He begged his brother not to call a surgeon. Not the knife, he said. God, not the knife. His brother took a rock. That was medicine too, in its own terrible way. In medieval Europe, war was never just political. Never just about land or power or vengeance. It was also about God, or more precisely, the version of God soldiers were told rode beside them. Religion didn't just bless medieval warfare, it helped justify it. From the pulpit to the sword, from the monastery to the battlefield, faith wasn't a passive witness to violence. It was often the match that lit it. The clearest example was the Crusades, a series of wars fought not only with weapons, but with sermons, relics, and divine promises. Soldiers were told they were absolved of sin before they even drew their blades, that if they died in battle, heaven awaited. It was not war, it was pilgrimage. Only instead of walking barefoot to Rome, they marched in mail across continents, burning, pillaging, and slaughtering as they went. Popes issued papal bulls, sacred edicts, declaring that those who took up the cross were doing God's work. These were not noble volunteers, most of them. Many were criminals seeking redemption, second sons with no inheritance, mercenaries who believed salvation could be bought in blood. They didn't spare women or children, or other Christians who got in their way. In 1099, when Crusaders took Jerusalem, they didn't just reclaim the city, they drenched it in blood. Muslims, Jews, locals, tourists, all slaughtered. The Crusaders waded through corpses to reach the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and sang hymns as they prayed. They believed they were cleansed, and they were, not spiritually, but literally, in the blood of those who dared not be them. But religion wasn't only a banner to march under. It lived in the minds of the soldiers too. Men claimed to see visions of angels before battle, to hear the voice of saints guiding their sword hand. Entire companies marched because someone had a dream that told them to, or because a relic had wept, or because a hermit in the woods had received a message from heaven. This wasn't rare. This was expected. The line between spiritual fervor and madness blurred until they became one and the same. Some commanders claimed divine authority, not just to lead men, but to decide who lived and died. One knight reportedly ordered his own soldiers executed for doubting his holy mission. Another had banners stitched with Christ's commands in Latin and claimed any who questioned him were heretics. How many truly believed it? Enough. Enough to fight. Enough to kill. Enough to die screaming the name of a God who had long since stopped answering. Sadly, even places of supposed peace, monasteries, abbeys, holy shrines, were often complicit in war. Some stored weapons in their cellars. Some trained young boys not just in scripture, but in swordplay. Some lent money to kings to fund campaigns, then profited from the spoils. Gold passed through church hands as easily as holy water. A bishop might bless an army one day and curse their enemies the next. Holy men rode into battle in armor, wielding maces, not because it was more righteous, but because they were forbidden from spilling blood. Maces, you see, crushed bones. The church made exceptions, and monasteries weren't always victims. When raiders approached, monks fought back. Some defended relics with sword and torch. Others opened their gates to armies in exchange for favors, or closed them, trapping civilians outside. The sacred was not always sanctified. Holy relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, pieces of sacred cloth were carried into battle like divine talismans. Armies believed they granted protection, that no arrow could pierce them, no fire consume them. They marched behind saints' skulls in golden boxes. They prayed over swords, whispered blessings into helmets, bathed wounds with holy water, water that often came from wells filled with ash and corpses. Soldiers clutched crosses not just for comfort, but for luck. They tattooed prayers into their skin. They carved psalms into their weapons. They recited the Lord's Prayer as they slit throats. In this world, salvation and slaughter were bedfellows, and God, or the idea of Him, was never far behind. And when things went wrong, when armies failed, when towns fell, when plague swept through the ranks, it wasn't seen as bad luck. It was seen as divine punishment, for sin, for doubt, for harboring heretics. Entire units might be whipped in penance. Priests might demand soldiers fast before a campaign. Some were denied burial if they died in battle wearing a cursed symbol. Others were excommunicated mid-war, declared enemies of both God and man. And yet, still, they believed, because what else could explain the madness? What else could give meaning to the slaughter? If God was not on your side, then what was the point of all the suffering? What was the point of the screams, the starvation, the pain? So they had to believe. They had to believe that war had purpose, that suffering meant something, that God was watching, and if he was, he watched men kill each other by the thousands and thanked him for the chance. The wounds you couldn't see were often the ones that never healed. The battlefield ends, the fires die, the banners fall. What remains? Not just the dead, but the living, and in them, a ruin of a different kind. Medieval war left its mark not only in bodies, but in minds. Yet no one called it trauma. No one had the words for it. No doctors wrote it down. But it was there, hiding behind vacant stares, trembling hands, and sudden screams in the night. We know it today as PTSD. They called it something else: cowardice, madness, divine punishment. But whatever the name, the pain was real. Surviving a battle wasn't always a victory. For many, it was a curse. Soldiers returned home limping, broken, half blind, and half sane. They couldn't sleep through the night. They heard phantom war horns in the distance. They smelled blood in their bread. When a thunderstorm rolled across the fields, they dove into ditches like arrows were falling again. And there was no help, no warm welcome, no treatment, no understanding. Men who once fought side by side were now seen as dangerous, haunted, unstable, unhinged. Some were shunned. Others wandered into the woods, muttering to themselves, flinching at shadows. In court records, you'll find vague references. His mind unwell, struck mad by war, no longer right of spirit. These weren't diagnoses, they were warnings. And for every man who screamed in his sleep, there were 10 more who said nothing, who carried the horror inside them like a disease that never broke the skin. Some couldn't bear to live among people again. They disappeared into caves, into monasteries, into self-imposed exile. They became hermits, not for enlightenment, but for escape. A knight from the 100 Years' War was found years later in the mountains of Auvergne, living among wolves, dressed in rags. He had built a shrine out of old bones. When asked his name, he wept and ran. He didn't forget the war. He was the war. Others wandered from village to village, offering prayers in exchange for food, whispering confessions to anyone who'd listen, begging for penance no priest could give. Some took vows of silence. Others mutilated themselves, cutting away the parts of their body they believed had sinned most. These weren't holy acts. They were attempts to forget. Trauma bled into medieval storytelling, not always directly, but in the gaps between the lines. In poems, knights lose their minds in haunted forests, fighting invisible enemies. In saints' lives, warriors are tormented by visions, torches of guilt and divine retribution. In miracle tales, wounded men cry out for years, unable to forget what they've seen. They wrote about cursed swords, haunted battlefields, rivers that ran with blood long after the war had ended. These weren't just metaphors. They were reflections of minds trying to process what no one dared say aloud. We came back, but we didn't come back whole. Even religious confessions changed. Soldiers spoke not just of sins, but of memories. I killed a man who was crying. I laughed as we burned their chapel. I watched my brother's head roll and did nothing. There was no forgiveness for these wounds, only the slow erosion of self. And society did not want to remember. They wanted stories of honor, of glory, of brave charges and noble deaths. So the trauma was buried, not in graves, but in memory. Kings built monuments to battles, not to the survivors. Bards sang of the fallen heroes, not the living wreckage. The returning soldiers, thin, hollow-eyed, silent, were reminders of the truth. And no one wanted the truth. They wanted legends. And so the men who carried the weight of war inside them learned to carry it alone, until it broke them. And even then, they were blamed. Because how could a man weep over something as noble as war? There are stories, not in history books, but in local legend, of ghost soldiers. Not literal spirits, but living men who wandered ruins of old battlefields. Men who refused to speak, who dug shallow graves for no one, who saluted empty fields, who whispered names no one else remembered. In a Welsh tale, a farmer claimed to see a man every morning before sunrise, standing in his field in full armor, staring at the horizon. He never moved, never spoke. When approached, he vanished. But the spot where he stood never grew crops again. That's the legacy of war, not just dead bodies, but places that never healed, and people who never escaped. Because the end of battle isn't the end of war. The swords stop, the banners fall, the silence returns. But in the minds of those who fought, the screams never leave. And sometimes, the worst wounds are the ones no one sees. Behind every clash of steel was a human story, full of fear, brutality, and survival. And now you've seen it. Not the version polished for paintings or polished Hollywood frames, but the one history books often skip, where war wasn't glory but grit, where the sword wasn't a symbol of honor, but just one more way to bleed, where knights were outnumbered by starving peasants, women stood on walls with boiling oil, and monks whispered secrets as the cities burned. This was medieval war as it really was, chaotic, cunning, cruel. A world where the dead outnumbered the remembered, and fear was more useful than any blade, where religion justified massacre, where betrayal was strategy, and where men came home with ghosts behind their eyes, hoping no one would ever ask them what they'd seen. So the next time you hear about the romance of the Middle Ages, of gallant knights, glorious battles, and banners waving over fair fields, pause. Look closer. Ask yourself, what stories were left untold? What screams were buried under centuries of silence? What wounds were never given names? History is not just victories, it's scars. And medieval warfare was full of them, carved into stone, into flesh, into memory. Because war has never been noble, only survivable. Thank you for coming on this journey with me tonight. I truly hope you go on to have a wonderful night's sleep and restful dreams. If you enjoyed this story, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and maybe even comment on other places you would like to visit, and I'll try and make it happen. But for now, settle down, relax, close your eyes, and drift off. May sound sleep and beautiful dreams come to you tonight. You deserve it.